I am Tamar, and this is Jewish Crossroads. Ilan Goldenberg stands out as one of the rare individuals across the Obama and Biden administrations who understands Israel and the American Jewish community with such deep intimacy. That stems not only from his longstanding commitment to the Middle East, but also from a biography that bridges both worlds. Born in Jerusalem to American parents who had made Aliyah, Ilan moved to New Jersey at age 8. He is fluent in Hebrew and also speaks Arabic. In the Obama administration, he navigated national security from the Pentagon to the State Department, first as a special advisor on the Middle East, then as Iran team chief in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy's office, offering vital counsel on Iran's nuclear program. Later, he served as chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, playing a key role in Secretary Kerry's push for permanent status peace talks. In the Biden era, Ilan continued shaping policy as special advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris on Middle East, defense, and technology, and as national director for Jewish outreach in Harris's 2024 presidential campaign. Most recently, he was tapped by J Street to serve as their senior vice president and chief policy officer. Shalom, Ilan, and welcome to Jewish Crossroads.
Shalom, Tamar. Great to be with you.
So we've covered your super impressive biography, but for me, the two most interesting details are the little points where our paths actually overlap. We were both born in Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopius in Jerusalem. And apparently, we both went in the 90s to Camp Tel Yehuda, you as a camper and me as a young counselor sent by the Israeli Scouts.
Huh. Wow. I don't know if we overlapped in particular years, but, I'll say Camp Tel Yehuda is pretty important in my family biography. My parents met at Camp Tel Yehuda when they were 14 years old, and they were both very involved in a young Judea. That's why one of the reasons they made Aliyah and ended up in Israel.
Let's jump from the sweet memories of summer camp in the 90s to the end of summer 2025, almost 2 years after October 7th, and still in the middle of this long and difficult war. How would you describe the current moment for Jewish life here in America?
It is really hard. Maybe the word I would use, and I've written some about this, is lonely in some ways, especially if you're a liberal Jew, which is really where, look, more than 70% of the American Jewish community is, just based in terms of value and history. But it's lonely because so many of the institutions that you're used to counting on are kind of in flux, starting with you expect the U.S. government to be on your side, defending you from things like anti-Semitism, and you can't really trust the Trump administration. I think American liberals have a really hard time trusting the Trump administration on this and feel like there's been this turn. We can all go back to this where like anti-Semitism and concerns about anti-Semitism are being used for many more things than just countering anti-Semitism when you're going after universities, when you're cutting research. I think there's also a feeling of loneliness because the Israeli government with Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and some of the things that they are doing and some of the things that are happening in Gaza don't necessarily reflect Jewish values. And then there's also, you kind of feel it from progressives too, and people who have been our traditional allies for so long. And I think many still are, and this is what I try to do in J Street, but also, feelings of loneliness, especially after October 7th, where that empathy that you would have expected from many of your allies wasn't quite there. And this kind of rise on the left of, I think, both, legitimate criticism and concern about Israeli policy, but then sometimes, I think, spilling into anti-Semitism, which is a real problem. And distinguishing between those two is very hard and complicated. But all these things are just, as an American Jew, really hard and really unnerving. And these are places where you're used to turning to guidance, comfort, alliance, and from all these different institutions. And frankly, it's also been hard for American Jewish institutions sometimes to reflect on, accurately where American Jews are dealing with all of this, including some of the traditional institutions who go too hard in one direction, and that doesn't, help either. And so, the word I use is kind of lonely, maybe unmoored.
during the first months of the war, the Biden administration, which you are an important part of, pressed Israel hard to allow as much humanitarian aid as possible into Gaza. When you look at the situation now in the Strip, I assume you must reflect on that Biden policy and also on how it compares to the current administration's approach.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been public and open, and I actually think in some ways we should have pushed harder and done some things differently in terms of trying to end the war earlier, in particular, in the Biden administration. But at the same time, we also did relentlessly push on the humanitarian situation. Like every day in conversations, we had our senior most leaders, including the president, pushing. The Trump administration has not continued that. Starting in March, when basically the ceasefire collapsed, there was a withholding of all aid for 2 months, something we did not support ever during the Biden administration. And then, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and this new concept that's really just not worked and has not gotten enough aid into Gaza. And now you're seeing the outcomes of that. And it's two things. I mean, I think it's a much worse humanitarian situation in Gaza. And one of the things that's so hard and frustrating is I think a lot of that reporting doesn't make its way into Israel. Now it's starting to.
It's starting in the
But
last few
yeah.
weeks, but very, very late.
Yeah, it's starting. But in the American Jewish community, it's really turning things. People who I've seen, who I've talked to, who I've worked with, who are being much more sharply critical of Israel than I've ever seen them be. Folks you definitely consider Zionist supporters, but also internationally. I mean, look, we were saving, I think, Israel in many ways from some of the worst international criticism by pushing on this, you know? And now you see what happens, and you see the international reaction when humanitarian crisis tips over into the horror it's now tipped over. I don't think that's in Israel's interest. I think this is a catastrophe for Israel internationally and how it is seen internationally. Certainly a catastrophe for the U.S.-Israel relationship, and specifically for American Jews relating to Israel. And these were things that, the Biden administration worked against, consistently telling the Israelis, on top of all the humanitarian reasons, consistently telling the Netanyahu government, look, guys, if this situation spills out of control from a humanitarian perspective, it's going to hurt your interests. It's going to hurt your ability to do things internationally. It's going to hurt your ability to fight Iran. It's going to hurt your ability to counter Hezbollah. And now we're seeing that,
But on the one hand, it's clear that President Biden stood firmly with Israel at the outset of the war. On the other hand, some critics argue that as the war went on, his support became more hesitant, whether in the delay on Rafah or in his concern about escalation on the northern front. In the end, the expansion of the battlefield against Hezbollah and later against Iran actually served Israel and created a significant positive shift in the region. Do you think that that criticism of Biden is justified, that he was very afraid of, a regional war, mainly maybe because of the elections in the U.S.?
Well, look, I think we have to separate this into two things: what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the region. What's happening in Gaza from the beginning, I was part of the team working on we need a day after, and I'll get to on the day after issues in particular, on if you want to defeat Hamas. I was really leading that in the first month or two of the war and concluded if you want to defeat Hamas, you need a real alternative. We proposed real alternatives and plans to the Israeli government as early as November 2023. And we had learned from our own very negative experiences in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Vietnam, what happens when you don't do that. You get stuck in a war, you're just killing people, you're going back into the same places again and again. You're not actually, if there's no replacement and if there's no viable alternative, you're just stuck. And that's what we were warning them about starting in November. IDF officials, Shabak, others who wanted to have real conversations with us about this, Netanyahu wouldn't let them because any alternative to Hamas has to be Palestinian. And that doesn't work for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. It doesn't work for, Israeli politics. And so it was, let's not worry about that. We'll worry about that later. But Netanyahu was saying, we can only have total victory, and then we can talk about the day after. Ridiculous. The day after starts the day, you're doing the day, when we defeated ISIS, the day after was part of the plan, in every city we went into. When we went into places like Mosul, we had a plan for how we're going to hold it, take it, and in the long term, replace, in Raqqa and places like that. So you got to take the Gaza piece where I personally concluded very early on, and I think many of us concluded as time went on, like, you're going to go into Rafah and do what? When Bibi said he was going to go into Rafah, this is total victory. We will be done. After Rafah, we will be done. That was February of 24, and here we are, and like it's not done. So Biden was completely right about that. We were completely right about that. It's being proven like every day. Now we're going in for more escalation. So I have zero, I don't buy that argument. We were not doing this to just restrain Israel. We were trying to restrain Israel from the humanitarian perspective. We were also, this is in Israel's interest, and this is about telling your friend, like, look, this isn't going to work. We've been through it ourselves, you know? The regional piece is very different. And there, I got to say, like, you know, Biden did, put restraints on Netanyahu, but Netanyahu also wanted many of those restraints. There was a lot of hesitation about going into Lebanon, in particular, not just from us, but from Netanyahu, from Dermer, from others. The IDF was pushing for it, but I think the estimates of how badly it would go or how serious the consequences would be in Israel were pretty significant. And at the end of the day, I think Israel kind of stumbled into it with, attacks in the Galilee in, I think it was August or July that kind of led to this escalation. And, our team had started working on like a ceasefire proposal that I think the Israeli government was also going to be comfortable with. And then it all just started going much better than anybody expected.
Mm-hmm.
At which point, like the Israeli government said, well, we want to keep going. And we said, yeah, this looks like it's actually going better than anybody expected. Go, right? Similarly, we supported Israel in shooting down rockets, multiple missile attacks coming from Iran. So one, I think at the end of the day, as the situation evolved, like maybe we and maybe Israel could have been a little more aggressive on Iran and Hezbollah earlier. The big issue still in my mind, still Gaza. And on that one, like I think we've been proven 100% right as this continues to go on.
I'll quote an American acquaintance of mine that said, but it's not only him. I've heard, this description many times in the past months. He said, I never voted for Trump. I guess I will never vote for him. I voted Democrat most of my life. But as a Jew who cares deeply about Israel, I have to admit, it's obvious to me that if Kamala Harris were president today, she would not have given Israel the green light for such a bold and risky operation in Iran. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, and actually, like, I don't think that like things are not like I know that there's a lot of joy right now, or sort of a feeling that like I think operationally, like Israel did incredibly well in Iran, which is what Israel has tactically. Israel did incredibly well in Iran, which Israeli ingenuity and ability to do tactics is like very impressive. And I spent 3 years at the Pentagon working on Iran. We were talking about the MOP back then, and we were talking about like I worked on plans to take out Fordo. I worked with Israeli officials on like having those kinds of conversations. This was maybe 15 years ago, and it was important to have and develop those options. And so I spent 3 years every day, like studying, analyzing, planning for how we would deal with the war with Iran, including one triggered by Israel. What I can say is, from an operational perspective, the peace went well, but like, where do we go from here? Like, we now have 400 kilos of highly enriched uranium. We don't know where it is necessarily. We don't have inspectors in the country anymore. That's vital, right? So, and there's no prospects for any kind of a deal now, anytime in the near future. So with all of that, basically we're now in a world where Iran's going to, continue to build out, try to get to a nuclear bomb probably. And we're going to have to count on Israeli and American intelligence, which is very good, especially Israeli intelligence. I mean, as they demonstrated during the war, to stop that and take it out again and again and again. So we might have this cycle again in a few months, in a year, in 2 years. And again, every time you have this cycle, you're going to have Iranians launching missiles at Israel. You're going to have people stuck in their shelters for maybe days at a time. Like, this is the new world we're probably living in. We're going to have to mow the lawn every few months, every couple of years. I don't know.
That's a big lawn.
It's a big lawn. It's a big lawn, and I still think would have been better if, Trump could have actually gotten a diplomatic deal, which we were still pursuing. Still go back to Obama's deal, which people have concerns with, and maybe like could have been stronger in certain places. But the reality is, Iran's nuclear program was way farther back in 2018 when Trump walked out of the deal than it was when the war happened. But also, frankly, like now we're in a much worse position than we were then because we have no eyes. We have no, the inspectors are so critical, and now the Iranians have every excuse
So, if I
to.
understand you, what you see in Gaza and in Iran is a lot of tactics, but a lack of a strategy. Would that be your
Yes.
argument?
And that's been a strategic problem for Israel for as long as I've worked on these issues. And part of it is understandable. Like when you're a small country surrounded, living in a tough neighborhood, surrounded by a lot of potential enemies, sometimes you don't have time to think about the long term. You're like, I just gotta deal with the problem. That's really nice. You guys want to talk about, hey, Americans, like with your two oceans and like physical space and your superpower. Like, I think it's great that you want to talk about what's going to happen 20 years from now. Like, we want to talk about, like, we have to just deal with tomorrow and we'll deal with 20 years from now. So I understand that philosophy. And I understand that it's a lot easier to talk about it from my comfort in my own home or, from like even from the Pentagon or the White House than it is like actually being in Israel every day. At the same time, like it also does cause real harm to Israel at times when you do need to think longer term. And Gaza is the perfect example of that, right? There was refusal to think longer term from the beginning. One of the reasons, 2 years on, Israel's still stuck in Gaza, right? Because we were trying from the start to have that longer term conversation with them where, I mean, President Biden said it when he came to Israel, right? He said, like, I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but it was basically like, we made terrible mistakes after 9/11 because we were angry, because we were upset. Like, don't make the same mistakes we did. And unfortunately, I think Israel is making every single mistake we made. And in some cases, consequences are higher for Israel because it's a smaller country.
In 2024, you made a big shift from policy work inside government to political campaigning. After advising Vice President Harris on the Middle East and defense and technology, you were called into her campaign after Biden dropped out to lead Jewish outreach. What are your main takeaways from those months?
Well, first of all, that was insane. Like a whole different world that I had to kind of learn and navigate, going from what was, the more, I would say, like well-mannered and well-behaved like world of like foreign policy nerds who don't, deal with politics to being deep in the weeds of it. A few things I would say though, and it's also one of the reasons I've ended up at J Street, in the aftermath is the experiences I took from that. One, I didn't really understand working at the White House how traumatized the American Jewish community was by everything that had happened after October 7th. Because I wasn't dealing with the community every day. Sometimes I had, they'd wheel me in to do like a policy update, but it's different. Like when your job is to talk to people every day and not just traumatized by, October 7th, but also the aftermath in the United States, specifically the protests on campus. Although I will say one thing about that is like, we talked to Jewish kids on campus. Like most of them are pretty calm about the whole thing and like living their lives. The people who were most worked up were consistently like the Jewish parents who were not on campus, but were like weren't there, but were terrified about what they were seeing. And so I didn't really understanding how hard that was. But at the same time, look, as part of the campaign, you also work with your Arab American outreach partner and Muslim American outreach partner. And happens in every like presidential campaign because you have two different communities who have different views on some of these issues. And, you want to be able to bridge and be consistent. And the trauma that they were feeling also so hard, just such a challenging issue overall, so that was like one just big takeaway of just how you wrestle with all of that. The other for me was though when you really started to dive down and talk to people, talk to Democrats and talk to Jewish voters. And most of them, what I really do feel happened after October 7th was you had this split inside the Democratic Party and also inside the Jewish community. And on the right, you kind of had Jewish organizations in particular, and some folks that were like, we're going to support Israel no matter what. And that means supporting Benjamin Netanyahu and this government no matter what. Then on the left, you had people who were on October 8th going out and protesting and saying things like genocide. Like, that is not where the overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party is, and the overwhelming majority of like Jewish voters are. And like I felt that for me, maybe like we're actually just about 1 year on from the Democratic National Convention. Like it was just seeing pictures in my Facebook last night of like from a year ago. The most meaningful moment for me in that convention was, John and Rachel, the parents of Hirsch, speaking, right? I was really nervous, right? About like, will they be booed? Will there be like, and instead you ended up with, just overwhelming, spontaneous chants of support combined with, message, the whole audience chanting, bring them home.
A
Like,
unifying
which,
moment. That's how it looked.
yeah, it was. And it was completely spontaneous. And I had, even more important, I had these like young campaign staffers who afterwards, like these are kids in their 20s who are really upset about what's going on with Gaza and are really on the far left, like, pretty far left of the Democratic Party. And they were like, thank you. Thank you for working on this. Thank you for bringing them. But their message was also really important, right? Their message was about unity. It was about humanity. It was also about the horrors of what was going on in Gaza. And like, that's where Democrats are. That's where American Jews are. That's where most people are. That's what I really took out of the campaign. They are not on these two extremes of Bibi Netanyahu and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and they are not, the encampments are and the like, and the kind of anti-Zionism. That's the, and for me, that was the lesson.
I'm guessing in your campaign work, you also heard disappointment from some Jewish Democrats about how the Biden-Harris administration has handled the radical elements within the party. I mean, those who undermine Israel's right to exist. In retrospect, what are your thoughts about that?
There are like, and it's really important to distinguish and try to take how you deal with this. It's also one of the reasons I've gone to J Street is like there's two approaches to this. One is like let's fight and try to single these people out and call anybody who is raising concerns about, Israel, like an Israeli policy in Gaza, let's just call them let's call anybody who's an anti-Zionist an anti-Semite, right? Which is one approach. And there are a lot of anti-Zionists who are anti-Semites. Let's be clear about that. But there are also a lot of people who, have real, genuine concerns about what's happening in Gaza, questions about whether or not a state that's fully based on religion. And I should be clear, like I am a Zionist and I continue that Israel should believe that Israel needs to be a democratic, Jewish, secure state. Like I've dedicated my entire career to that. But I have conversations, including with friends who are like, it's not possible to be a state based on religion and still be democratic. You need to have democracy for you have to have equal rights in Israel for all, and that means a binational state. Like I don't agree with those people. I don't think that that's a practical solution. I do agree with the fact that everybody needs equal rights. I don't agree with the notion of a binational state. I don't think it works.
But those who say
that
that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism talk a lot about singling out Israel. I mean, if you're against national states or religion-based states, there are some more countries more than Israel, but you always hear only about dismantling the state of Israel.
The way I see it and approach it, sort of the argument, like, so look, that's why there are anti-Zionists who are anti-Semitic, right? I'm not saying there aren't, like, I'm not saying that, but the question is whether every single person who is an anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite. Like, is Peter Beinart, who has spent years working these issues and moved further and further to the left and decided that, like, he doesn't think Israel can, like, and is an Orthodox Jew, like, is he an anti-Semite? Is a Palestinian who is living in Gaza, whose family basically, used to live in like Jaffa before 1948 and was moved to Gaza and like, basically some of them were expelled, some of them moved on their own. Like there's all history there, like, and just wants to go back to their home, which they're realistically never going to be able to do, I think, even in any deal, and wants to just have, are they an anti-Semite necessarily, or do they just want to go back to their family and their home and their, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and if that's the case, is every Israeli who does not believe there can be a Palestinian state because they're concerned about their own genuine security concerns, which is again not where I am, but like I think that there is a way to do it. But like, are they all like automatically anti-racist, anti-Palestinians? Like, because they uniquely don't think that Palestinians have their own right to self-determination. Like, I think that there is a lot in this that like is really simplified when you just say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, even if, there are certainly chunks of, people on the far left. Frankly, the other experience I had from dealing with the Democratic Party is most of those people actually aren't in the Democratic Party. They're people who are like standing on the outside yelling and protesting. Like they're not voting. They didn't vote for Kamala Harris. Like they voted for like Jill Stein or they didn't vote at all, right? So like it's just the levels and layers on this are very complicated. And I have found education, talking to these people, trying to move them, trying to make them, empathizing with like you're horrified about what's happening in Gaza. I get it. Like I agree with you on the horror of that. Like at the same time, like, like blaming American Jews for that, that's anti-Semitic. Like, helping people, and that happens by having people actually sit in these places and Jews and actually engage with these folks instead of like kind of the approach of these people are all anti-Semites. We can't engage with them. We must excise them entirely. Like they're only going to get madder. They're only going to get louder. Like it's only going to bring more people to their side. So it's also how you deal with it that matters.
Was it a mistake not to choose Josh Shapiro as her running mate for vice president? And were the rumors true? Those that argued that he was rejected because of his Jewish identity.
So first of all, like I was not close enough to the inner circle to like have any like sense at all of like the decisions on that. Look, at the end of the day, I don't think vice presidential candidates like determine elections. I think it's a lot, at least from what I've heard, it's a lot about like just personal chemistry and like who clicks with who. And the sense I just got, from what I heard, and I think it's what's out there, is just like she just clicked with, Walls better than Shapiro. And like it's not, and you have to work with this person for 4 years and trust them and have that kind of personal relationship. It's not, people see it as this cold, calculated, will this decision get me like this state or that state or this thing or that thing? I don't think it had anything to, it wasn't really about that. I always, that whole thing happened actually before I even joined the campaign. But yeah, I was personally appalled by the attacks on Shapiro. And that is like, as far as I'm concerned, like that's a good example actually of kind of anti-Semitism because Shapiro's views were not different than so many other Democratic leaders, candidates, individuals on Israel and Gaza, right? He was not out of the mainstream of the Democratic Party. And yet somehow like people started attacking him. Why? I mean, it's because he's Jewish. So in that case, like that, and then attributing that position to him. And also you had this attack on Shapiro a couple months ago, right? The guy who went into his house and tried to kind of light it on fire, right? And throw Molotov cocktails in there because of Gaza. But like, why Josh Shapiro versus like so many other like politicians, candidates who took very similar positions to Josh Shapiro? Like, why? Because he's one of the most high profile Jewish politicians in this space. So I was appalled by all those incidents, but I don't think that's what drove the decision on VP.
Is it harder when anti-Semitism comes, from your own camp? Because we've known right-wing anti-Semitism for many years, yes, and the alt-right, it's a not huge rise in last months. But when it comes from the left, does it hurt more?
Yeah, I mean, I think people take it harder. You also need to think of it in two different pieces, right? I mean, you can't bundle it all together. There is like genuine anti-Semitism, right? Like the guy who attacked Josh Shapiro, the guy who, the attack in Boulder, the attack in Washington. Like these are cases of violence. These are cases of clearly blaming Jews for the behavior of Israel, which I think is just pure like anti-Semitism. And you have this other challenge, which is a little different. I'm not sure I'd call it anti-Semitism. I would call it like lack of empathy, lack of sympathy, and after October 7th, I think what you had was a lot of people who I think American Jews counted as allies in progressive spaces who weren't leaning in, just provide the kind of support and sympathy that you'd expect when you had a very traumatized and upset Jewish community. and didn't treat American Jews in the same way that other minorities get treated in situations like that. Now I don't think all those people are, I asked actually, I was on a campus and I had a conversation with a number of Jewish students and I asked them precisely this question. I said, how have you felt about anti-Semitism since October 7th? And most of them said, like, I haven't really felt that. Right? I haven't felt like blatant anti-Semitism, but I have felt this loneliness. I can't suddenly like the environmental club is doing a resolution on Gaza and like I feel uncomfortable in this space and what they're saying doesn't like it's talking about the horrible humanitarian situation, but it's not talking about the experience of, Jews. And frankly, like I'm less concerned about now that's a little bit different than it was 2 years ago. But when you're doing a resolution like that, like on October 20th, 2023, I mean, that's a real lack of sensitivity, And so, but they were like, but they're like, they describe things like that in their mind, at least that was not anti-Semitism.
That
I don't
circles
know.
back
It
to
goes
what
back.
you said at the beginning of the conversation about loneliness, about feeling
Yeah,
lonely as a
exactly.
Jewish American.
Yeah.
You must be familiar with a criticism within some parts of the Jewish community that say, okay, J Street started as a counterweight to the more conservative AIPAC, but after October 7th, they crossed a red line. And they're talking about J Street supporting restrictions on arms transfers to Israel during the war. And for critics, that was like going too far. Late, just last week it was Jeremy Ben-Ami not adopting the term genocide, but let's say flirting with the term
Yeah.
genocide. He said, "I won't use it. J Street won't use it, but in the future, I think that in Hague it will be decided that Israel committed genocide." And I know that you differ in these two
Yeah.
topics from Jeremy Ben-Ami. Can you talk a little about that and share your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. And look, just that's part of that is like Jeremy and I can have slightly different differences on this because as an organization, like what we are trying to build here is a big tent, right? Which really does appeal across most of the American Jewish community. And frankly, at this point, I think we represent the 70% of American Jews. We really do we sit at the 50-yard line of like the Democratic Party. Like, and we sit, I think, where 70% of American Jews are. And that means, like at its core, support for Israel as a Jewish, democratic, secure state, and support for Palestinian rights, belief that Palestinians deserve a state of their own, support for acknowledging like the horrific attacks of October 7th, the atrocities of that day, and the fact that Israel has the right to respond. And J Street, did not call for a ceasefire for a number of months and, stood out there and took a lot of heat from a lot of progressive organizations for not doing that and for supporting Israel's right to defend itself and respond. At the same time, also just real concerns about the humanitarian crisis at this point and what is happening. And, this is also where most American Jews are, like very strong opposition. This was a common theme I found across when I talked to folks on the campaign, right? When I talked, almost every American Jew I talked to who's a Democrat, whether they're more like a J Street Democrat or an AIPAC Democrat or something in between, they all don't like Bibi Netanyahu because he's so politicized the whole thing, like, and so put himself in line with Trump that he's really like, and so real opposition to this government, which is also where, again, 75% of, the Israeli public is at this point. And so like those are the things we focus on. Now, within that, there are like harder questions and disagreements about some of these tougher issues that you don't have to align with us on everything to agree on the issue of arms. Look, I've spent years providing, kind of like working on the US-Israel relationship, supporting arms sales to Israel, helping facilitate arms sales to Israel. Working on things like the supplemental with $14 billion that we sent to Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, which by the way, J Street supported also. And not only supported, but actually like lobbied folks on the Hill, including folks on the left who would never listen to an organization like AIPAC, but do listen to us when we say no. And do listen to us when, we, for example, when Bibi was coming to visit Washington last July, and you had all these Democrats who did not want to go see him and sit in Congress with him. We set up an event with with Israeli hostage families. And you had more than 100 members of Congress there, including a lot who did not go to the speech afterwards, being able to say, I support Israel. I stand with the hostage families, even if I object to Bibi Netanyahu. Like these are things we do. And like J Street doesn't get much credit for that, but nobody else could, right? Because we're actually trusted on the left. We're trusted with progressives. On arms, look, arms is one I've really personally struggled with. I wrote a piece. I never really personally thought I would ever support blocking any arms sale to Israel. But this latest round, and I should clarify like what our position is, right? Like with J Street, we don't support an arms embargo. We support all defensive weapons, Iron Dome. We were lobbying a couple weeks ago against legislation that Marjorie Taylor Greene was pushing on Iron Dome, and 410 Democrats voted for it, and like I think or members of Congress voted for it, and 4 or 5 voted against it total. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we were lobbying in support of keeping Iron Dome. But 2,000-pound bombs or rifles for Itamar Ben-Gvir that he's going to give out to settlers in the West Bank. These were the 2 votes this past week, 2 specific pieces of legislation at a moment when the crisis in Gaza is just, Netanyahu was talking about going in deeper. Israeli society has had enough. Israeli security officials are saying enough, to block that, like in order to send a message, something I never thought I would support and do. I decided it made sense. And not just me, a whole bunch of senators who, including Jewish senators, including people who had never voted for this kind of stuff before, people like Alyssa Slotkin, who spent years working in the Pentagon and the CIA and came out, with a statement in support of this. People like Amy Klobuchar, people like Patty Murray, Jack Reed, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. These are not like lefty, bleeding heart liberals who, these are strong, lifelong supporters of Israel, as I am, who are saying like, enough, enough. This is just horrible. And it's also not good for you. Like, it's not good for Israel. You see what's happening, And so that is, and, tried a lot of other alternatives. On the genocide question, first of all, I hate the genocide debate because I think like it's not really all that constructive. Like what you call it, like really doesn't matter, in my opinion. Or it should matter so much less than like, let's work to stop what's going on, right? There's real suffering. There's real humanitarian like suffering in Gaza. And by the way, Jeremy agrees with me on this too. Like that, like the most important thing is like stopping the war, getting, the hostages out, getting aid in. It's not like what we call it. There is all kinds of legal stuff about whether or not like this is genocide or not. Like courts will figure that out, and it really depends on your interpretation of it. Like I think for many Jews, and this is the point Jeremy was making, like all that stuff doesn't matter as much as like I associate genocide with the Holocaust. This is like where it comes back to, and like that's not what's happening in Gaza as far as I see it. And so I'm like not gonna call it that, right? And again, I don't see the point. My whole effort is bringing people on board, is having real conversations. The word genocide shuts down all conversation, right? If like you're an American Jew, if you're somebody has real concerns about what's happening in Gaza and you don't know exactly what to do with it, and I roll in and I'm like genocide, like well, so like why, like this is kind of how I see it, but it's different people see it differently and feel very strongly about this.
Yeah, let me just add my own note here that personally I find it clear that there's no genocide happening in Gaza, and that words do matter because I think it's meant to demonize Israel, and shuts off other really important conversations that we should have, as you say. But more broadly, beyond J Street, I guess my underlying question about progressive Zionist people in the U.S. is, if you support restricting arms transfers to Israel, and if you believe or flirt with the idea that Israel is committing genocide, aren't you just a step away from Peter Beinart's ideology? I mean, in other words, isn't that a very small distance from being a Zionist to becoming maybe not anti-Zionist, but post-Zionist or non-Zionist? I mean, is progressive Judaism inevitably heading there?
I don't know the answer to that. I hope not, because I'm very much a liberal Zionist, and that's not where I want to see us go. I think much depends on what happens next year in Israel. There's an election coming at some point. And I mean, look, you're Israeli, you know this much better than I do. Polls don't look very good for Netanyahu, but there's still scenarios where like things get stuck or we end up back in the world of like 2020, 21, like we just have multiple elections, right? But like, if you get a different government, there is a real opportunity to turn the page. It's not going to mean American Jews and Israelis, Jews completely align on everything. Like if it's like a Bennett-led government, like, you're still going to have challenges, obviously. But, when the people who are playing the role of Itamar Ben-Gvir and like Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich are Yair Lapid and Yair Golan, like that's a different Israeli government. Like when the key partners are different. And that's a different Israel. And I think, frankly, I think that's the Israel that, most Israelis want at this point. They're not like jumping to go run to the two-state solution like tomorrow. Like there's not a lot of love for Palestinians. I get that. But there's also like a realization that like this government is like digging Israel into just a horrible hole. And then we can start having like real conversations again between American Jews and the Israeli government with a government that actually like cares and wants to engage and like can find some common values, even if we don't agree on everything. And like that can start to move things to a better place. The war can end, the hostages can come home, the humanitarian situation in Gaza can be addressed. I think that that's now, if that's the future Israelis choose, like in the government Israelis choose, I think there's a real opportunity to start rebuilding some of the damage. If they keep choosing Bibi Netanyahu and his ilk, like I think American Jews might just throw up their hands and be like, well, we're just not the same anymore. Like we're just in different places. And then I think more people go off in that direction.
2026 as a crucial moment for the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. I want to
sure.
circle back to the campuses. You've written in a really interesting way about your own awakening in college. You came from a Jewish day school, Jewish summer camps, and was just one narrative about Israel. That's what you write. Yeah. And then at college, you encounter other narratives and facts. And you wrote, eventually, I came to accept that there are multiple narratives and traumatized people on all sides of this conflict. And instead of trying to sort out who is right or wrong, the best thing I could do was stick with my initial mission of trying to end the conflict. And I think about this in the context of today's universities, because, in the 90s, you as a Jewish student encountered new narratives and decided to stay committed to peace, to end the conflict. Right now, the narrative that, Jewish students are hearing is end the state of Israel. That's like a very, very dramatic shift. What are your thoughts about what's happening in campuses and what changed since the 90s?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, the conversations that were most meaningful to me back then, it's not what most students are like. There is the people, what I was doing was studying Arabic and actually spending time in the Middle East and talking to professors from the Middle East who had spent their careers and were professionals working on this. And some of them had very different views than I have today and very different views. But like that is a like mature and reasonable kind of conversation. Whereas opposed to like, I think there's a lot of students who are like getting, if you're getting this off of like, the kids out in the streets screaming and like TikTok, that's a different kind of conversation than the one experience that I had. But the thing is, like the people like me who had that experience, and it's very common, like if you're a foreign policy national security professional working on the Middle East and you are Jewish, like which especially before 9/11 is what most Americans who actually cared about these issues and went into them were Jewish. A lot of us had this experience. And I think that experience still happens for like the kids who really dive deep, who are really committed to their Judaism, who came from a background like that. There's a lot of the kids that we have at J Street U at this point. We have a whole organization of, about like a couple thousand students on like 50 different campuses. And they are not the kids who are going to like the encampments. They're not that, They are also not the kids who are and students who are, out there with like the kind of Israel no matter what, which is, like they are holding this very hard place on campus in between the two. And like a lot of them have experiences similar to the one I had. And it really was like, I compare sometimes to like almost like a mourning experience. Like the whole like when I wrote about this, like the 5-step process. Like first it was like total denial that this was even happening. Like, when you hear like different histories about 1948, for example, followed by like real anger at my own community and my parents for not exposing me to all the different stories to eventually this, acceptance of like, hey, let's just try to make it better. I still think that's happening for the kids who are and the students who are like the future professionals, for the future like yous and me's of the world, like who are really going to care about this, like that experience still exists on campus, I think.
That brings me to the steps the Trump administration has taken against American universities. I assume you oppose these steps. And I want to put to you the argument made by Jason Greenblatt, Trump's former advisor, at a recent Sapir event. He said, yes, the steps are dramatic. They are even extreme, but you need to fight fire with fire, meaning that the situation on campuses had gotten so bad, so extreme, that only really extreme measures could change things. What is your response?
I think fighting fire with fire only gets you more fire, right? Fighting fire with water makes a lot more sense. That's how you put out a fire. And I think what we were doing in the Biden administration, like there was, look, first of all, in the spring of 23, there was just a very slow response because nobody really understood what was happening and universities were not ready to deal with it. And I don't think we were fully ready to deal with it. However, by the summer and into the fall, like there was a real shift in approach, a real buckling down on like getting this right. And what that involved was, actually using the Department of Education, actually like threatening investigations and starting investigations against universities, about also like working with universities to, put in place policies and give them guidance, which is what we did throughout the summer. By the fall of 2024, like things were just meaningfully different on campus than they were in the spring of 23. They had already gotten like much better. And you could have just continued on that approach, which was already like shifting, the situation and engaging using the tools that existed. And now what the Trump administration has come in and done is just kind of like, going after academic freedom, targeting. And look, there have been some, like Columbia did a terrible job of like handling what they've been dealing with. So there's been a few universities. It's also true that they have the hardest spot because universities that struggled the most are the ones in urban campuses where like the reality is most of the people doing the worst stuff at Columbia, this, I think, right? You're very familiar with Columbia. Right? I think a lot of the challenges there also come from the crazy, sort of like the extremists who come off of campus in a place like New York and occupy, but and just kind of do crazy stuff. But I think we are getting to a better place. And I think the danger of what the Trump administration has done, it actually feeds an anti-Semitic narrative.
In what
right?
way?
I guess it's because of the Jews that like we're cutting off all this research, right? And money. It's because of the Jews that I'm an international student and I'm afraid to talk in class because if I say anything about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I might get deported. It's because of the Jews and it's, specifically like it's those like high value donors who talk to Trump, right? So then it's even more anti-Semitic, right? Like who are, trying to change the way universities are run and trying to like handle academic freedom or trying to are encouraging people to be deported. I don't think that it's basically taking a whole bunch of things that like, and by the way, like the polling shows that overwhelmingly American Jews like disapprove of the way Trump is handling this. So this is not just, some part of this is also just a really important thing to remember. Like 70% of American Jews voted for Kamala Harris. 70% of American Jews like support Democrats and are liberal. Like that's where an organization like J Street comes in. Sometimes the 30% are like a lot louder. So, but now they're all uncomfortable with this, but they're also getting blamed by all these other people who are seeing what the Trump administration is doing. And what the Trump administration is doing is not about anti-Semitism. Like, taking like $900 million away from Brown or Harvard is because they don't like academia. It's because they don't like liberal academia. And so they want to have a war with liberal academia. They want to go after these institutions. And like, what are we going to do? We're going to say it's for the Jews. Like, how is that good for American Jews? How is that good for countering anti-Semitism? Really, I think, going to just fuel it.
Well, Ilan, we've reached the final part of our conversation, the Jewish Crossroad questionnaire. 5 quick and fun questions. Are you ready?
Ready to roll?
What's your earliest Jewish memory?
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. See, I should have like listened to the whole end of a podcast before so I know the answer to it. I mean, I'll probably say like running around the sukkah, like in Jerusalem, being afraid of bees, being like 3 or 4 years old, like in our house in Jerusalem.
If you could meet any Jewish figure from history, ancient or modern, who would it be and why?
Hmm. All right. Let's go with, I'll go with Ben Gurion, just because like
That's a
just
safe one.
super fascinating. Yeah, it's safe. That's right. But I'm a policy nerd. I'm a national security guy. I'm a foreign policy person. So like really talking through and understanding with him, like, all right, like what were you calculating in all these different steps where you're making some of these different decisions, I think would be like really interesting to understand.
What is your favorite or most meaningful Jewish tradition?
I love Seder. That's just, it's because it's like just getting the family together every year.
If you could jump 100 years into the future, what would you hope to see for the Jewish people?
Like in Israel, I mean, fully integrated into the Middle East with no more enemies, Palestinian state living side by side with Israel at that time, and a thriving American Jewish community that feels incredibly close and tied and aligned with Israeli and American values. They can be different, but just much more aligned than where it feels like we are at the current moment.
What's one Jewish word? It could be in Hebrew, English, Yiddish, Arabic that you speak as well, or otherwise, that feels particularly meaningful to you right now.
I guess Chai always just jumps into my mind, 18, right? Just maybe what, I'll change it. I'll go with pikuach nefesh. I'll go with that terminology right now because like given just like the importance of life over almost everything else in Judaism, I think is like what that concept says to me. You probably had some rabbis on here who do much better with these kinds of questions, but pikuach nefesh to me, just especially at this moment with what is happening in Gaza, with what is happening in Israel, with everything that we are seeing, and everything at the end of the day, what I'm spending every day on, which is, end the war, bring the hostages home, get aid into Gaza, like that lines with those two words.
Without being a rabbi, you've done very well, although you haven't listened to any chapter till the end. That's what we discovered here. So you have
It's
a
true.
chance
I
now.
did.
You have a chance now. Ilan Goldenberg, it's been such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for this conversation. Toda.
Toda rabba.
That's it for this episode of Jewish Crossroads. We'd love to hear from you, so feel free to write to us at jewishcrossroadspod@gmail.com. Thank you to Tomer Bar, who edited this chapter. We'll see you next time, same place, same journey, with a new voice. See you soon.